And joining us now, former state senator Dwight Bullard. He's also president of the South Miami-Dade branch of the NAACP. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. Now, COVID-19 exposed health and economic disparities, and then the killing of George Floyd is again exposing these social and criminal injustices African Americans face, and many are calling for change. But what are some of the steps that can be taken right now to bring about a change in a meaningful way?
Well, it really falls on a myriad of elected officials and community residents to really step into the gap and make sure that real change happens. I don't want to not reflect on what the future holds, but I want to pay attention to the past. Miami-Dade County, for instance, has the authority to create a civilian oversight panel of police. They've had that in statute for decades now, and yet the current county mayor has not funded that program. The previous county mayor had not funded that program. We talk about in 2012 the repeal and a reform of Stand Your Ground, and there were cries then of the disproportionate number of African American lives that were being impacted by the use of that law after the death of Trayvon Martin. Yet again, there seemed to be no interest or excitement in moving the needle on that law. So what I would say is the redress of those kinds of policies that have severe racial impacts have to be addressed at the state, county, and federal levels. And of course, the protest and people advocating is absolutely important, but I need to find the courage on the part of these elected officials who continuously choose to, in essence, racially dog whistle by the failure to pass policies that could have addressed these issues years ago.
Well, Dwight, speaking of election, believe it or not, we're just 5 months away from the presidential election, and right now the messaging from President Trump and former Vice President Joe Biden couldn't be more different. What do you make of the different tones in their leadership? The president talking about law and order and the need to maintain order on the streets, while Joe Biden is speaking more from a voice of compassion.
Well, I appreciate the differentiation between the two candidates, if you will. I know we have a president in the White House, but the reality is that he is stirring and has continued to stir racial hate really since his election and inauguration back in 2017. In the case of Vice President Biden, I appreciate the fact that he's been present. He's actually convened conversations with the Black community, not only in his home state of Delaware, but around the country via Skype, and trying to have conversations to move it forward. But there has to be more. There has to be more, and there has to be intention. The reality is that policies passed by the vice president have detrimentally impacted the black community, and those issues need to be addressed. The reality is that the current administration has yet to show any compelling desire to want to address the issue of the racial divide, the racial wealth gap, or any of the aforementioned problems. But I also want to draw attention that here in Miami-Dade County, we are electing a new mayor in just over 2 months, which is a more critical election for us here. We're electing the potential to elect state attorneys in Broward and Dade, the opportunity to elect the sheriff in Broward. So those are elections that are even more important, especially when we're talking about addressing critical issues around racial wealth, mass incarceration, drug policy, social justice, and mental health policies, because this is ultimately what people are talking about. People are tired of saying the same thing and seeing no redress by people that claim to be elected and serving in our best interest. The reality is that the moment of silence, the days of thoughts and prayers have to come to an end when we're talking about addressing real life situations that are resulting in the exponential number of deaths of Black people that have been happening through policy for decades.
You mentioned the importance of that mayoral race in Miami-Dade County, and we can't stress enough that there are candidates that have come out in favor of that civilian oversight panel that you mentioned. So very important that voters do their homework and know what they're getting into as they head to the polls in just a couple of months here. Now, it feels as if we've been having this conversation for a very long time about policing and accountability. Why do you think it's been so difficult to institute real change?
Well, I mean, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but we're talking about an institution. You think of Miami-Dade County, city of Miami in particular. The first African-American police officers weren't allowed to carry guns, and weren't allowed to arrest white citizens in their own city. So I say that to say that from its onset, the policy has had racial undertones that have failed to be addressed and have only been compounded since then. The way in which Black communities are policed versus other communities is something that fails to be addressed. If you talk to Black citizens in Liberty City and Miami Gardens, they view policing as an exercise of military intent, as an exercise in violence, versus our counterparts who live in Miami Beach, who live in Coral Gables, who live in these other areas, who can honestly say the notion of serving and protecting is something they feel, versus that of Black residents who've had a long-standing issue with the way in which policing is drawn out. And that's again, custom, a combination of custom policy and practice that has gone on for far too long.
Dwight Bullard, we certainly appreciate your perspective and your time. Thank you very much for joining us tonight here on CBS 4 News at 7.
We'll be right back. Stay with us.